The first section of your chapter on the Constitution discusses the historical background that led to American independence and ultimately the Constitution. This lecture will add some detail to that background. As your chapter mentions, the people of the British colonies had nearly a century and a half of experience in colonial governance prior to gaining independence through the Revolutionary War. While that century and a half of experience was formally under the rule of the British Crown, it's also true that the colonists enjoyed a great deal of autonomy, or self-determination, in the New World. The Atlantic Ocean operated as a pretty substantial buffer that left the colonies somewhat to their own devices on a large range of issues, so long as they pledged their loyalty to the Crown, and as long as they paid taxes and helped enrich the economy of Britain. The colonists in the New World had a great deal of freedom to manage their own affairs. For the most part, Britain had bigger things to worry about than keeping the colonies under tight control. To the central government in Britain, the New World colonies were certainly an important part of their empire, but Britain had more pressing problems in dealing with internal turmoil at home and in competition with world powers such as France and Spain. So, with relatively relaxed supervision from the home country, the colonists developed experience managing their own political affairs. Each colony adopted its own constitution, spelling out the rules for government within each colony's territory. Each colony had its own legislature, where representatives elected by colonists met to debate and resolve issues facing the community. The picture on this slide depicts a reenactment of a meeting of Virginia's House of Burgesses, one of the colonial legislative bodies. The colonies also developed their own court systems to administer the law. In other words, many of the building blocks for the form of self-government enshrined in the Constitution were developed during the colonial period. Colonists in North America were particularly drawn to relatively new ideas coming out of Europe about the purpose of government and politics. Broadly speaking, these are the political philosophers of the Enlightenment, whose writings provided the intellectual foundations for a transformation in how governments across the world are structured. In particular, the philosophies of John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, both pictured on this slide, were important to how the framers of the Constitution understood the purpose of government. Some of their ideas might be familiar to you. Things like natural rights. Locke phrased this as life, liberty, and property, while Jefferson added his own flourish in the Declaration of Independence by referring to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The idea of natural rights is that these are qualities inherent to all human beings, and they cannot be denied by government. Related to natural rights is the idea of individualism. People enjoy natural rights as individuals. Therefore, government cannot deprive individuals of their rights, even when it might be convenient to serve the demands of the larger community. The framers also affiliated with the idea of the social contract, which is the idea that people join together in civil societies and give up some of their absolute freedoms to the collective will expressed through the rule of law. The idea of the social contract is that by each individual giving up some freedom by submitting to the general will, each person is able to live in greater freedom than would occur if no government existed to prevent individuals from abusing each other's natural rights. What's crucial here is the idea that the people collectively create government in order to achieve a common good. They must have the consent of the governed in order to be legitimate. Now, this may sound pretty basic because this is the proverbial water of government in the United States in which we swim, but it really contrasts with ideas about government that had dominated before the Enlightenment, that ultimate authority rested with a monarch, not with the people, that the monarchs could trample on individual rights if it served some larger national goal. Considering how much the colonies had to rely upon their own initiative in charting their way forward in the New World, it's not too surprising that they were a particularly fertile ground for the ideas of philosophers like Locke and Rousseau to take hold. So, what went wrong between the colonies and Great Britain that led to an ultimate split? The key turning point is the French and Indian War and its aftermath. This is the name for the North American portion of the broader 7 Years' War that was fought between the British and French empires. This war was expensive for Britain. The British government attempted to recoup some of the costs of the war by imposing new taxes on the colonies. Your textbook mentions the Stamp Act, which taxed things in the colonies such as playing cards, newspapers, and legal documents. This was a very unpopular move because it taxed things that were a basic part of daily life in the colonies. Playing cards were a major source of leisure activity at the time, and it struck the colonists as unjust that they should have to pay the king just for the right to have a card game. Imagine how unpopular it would be if every time you streamed something on YouTube or Netflix, you had to pay a tax. That's something like what the Stamp Act meant to the colonists. Your textbook chapter does a good job of explaining how the situation devolved from there. I won't repeat the details here. Instead, I'll just note that the Stamp Act kicked off a vicious cycle in which the colonists would protest and resist actions by the British government, and each act of resistance would be met with a harsher and harsher response from Britain, until ultimately Boston Harbor was under siege and colonists were forced to house British troops in their homes. This was a far cry from the relative autonomy they once enjoyed, and they viewed the British government as having lost the consent of the governed.